The last person I wanted sitting beside my hospital bed was my daughter-in-law, and somehow she became the only one who stayed. I remember the exact moment because the room felt unusually quiet. The heart monitor hummed softly beside me, and the late afternoon sun painted pale stripes across the floor of the hospital room. I had been admitted 2 days earlier after a series of tests that left more questions than answers. At 72 years old, I thought I understood uncertainty. I thought I understood fear. What I did not understand was why my son was nowhere to be found while Grace sat in the chair beside me for the third night in a row. My name is Eleanor Brooks, and for nearly 15 years I believe my daughter-in-law had slowly taken my son away from me. Every missed holiday, every canceled dinner, every family disagreement. Somehow, in my mind, it always led back to her. If Daniel forgot to call, I blamed Grace. If family plans changed, I blamed Grace. If I felt lonely, I blamed Grace. Looking back now, I can see how easy it is to build a story around pain. The difficult part is admitting that the story might be wrong. On that evening, however, I was not interested in reflection. I was tired, uncomfortable, and frustrated. Grace sat quietly near the window reading a magazine she never seemed to turn the pages of. Every so often she glanced toward me to make sure I was awake. It irritated me more than it should have. "You do not have to stay here," I finally said. She lowered the magazine and offered a small smile. "I know. Daniel should be here. He is trying to get here." I looked away toward the hallway. That answer only annoyed me more. Daniel always seemed to be trying to get somewhere. Trying to call. Trying to visit. Trying to make time. Yet somehow time never appeared. Grace stood and adjusted the blanket near the end of my bed. "The doctor said they should have more information tomorrow morning," she said. "You should try to rest." I almost laughed. Rest. Hospitals were filled with noises designed to prevent rest. Footsteps, doors opening, machines beeping, conversations drifting through walls. Yet despite everything, Grace remained calm. The next morning I woke before sunrise. The chair beside the window was still occupied. Grace had fallen asleep, sitting upright with her coat folded beneath her head. For a moment, I simply watched her. She looked exhausted. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes. Her hair was pulled back carelessly. She did not look like someone trying to impress anyone. She looked like someone who had not gone home. Later that day, Daniel finally arrived. He rushed into the room carrying his briefcase and a worried expression. Before he could say anything, Grace stood and quietly stepped aside. She did not complain. She did not seek attention. She simply gave him the space to be my son. It was such a small thing that I almost missed it. Almost. That evening, after Daniel left for another meeting, Grace returned to the chair beside my bed. The room grew dark. The city lights appeared beyond the window. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Then she said something that made me look at her differently for the first time. "There are things you do not know, Eleanor," she said softly, "and I think it is finally time you did." For several seconds I simply stared at Grace. The room felt smaller somehow. Outside the window, the lights of the city flickered against the dark sky, and somewhere down the hallway a nurse pushed a cart past my door. "What do you mean?" I asked. Grace looked down at her hands before answering. "I mean there are things that happened over the years that you never knew about." I felt my jaw tighten. Part of me expected another explanation, another excuse, another attempt to smooth over the distance that had existed between us for so long. Instead, she seemed unusually careful. "Then tell me," I said. She hesitated. "Not tonight." I almost laughed. "You bring up a mystery and then refuse to explain it?" A faint smile crossed her face. "You need rest more than another argument." Before I could respond, the door opened and a nurse entered to check my vitals. The conversation ended there. Yet after Grace left the room later that evening, I found myself unable to sleep. Her words kept returning to me. "There are things you do not know." The next morning the doctor arrived shortly after 8 o'clock. Dr. Michael Turner reviewed several test results and assured me that the situation was manageable. More monitoring would be necessary, but the news was better than expected. I should have felt relieved. Instead, my thoughts remained fixed on Grace. Around noon, Susan Harper stopped by. Susan had been my closest friend for nearly 20 years. She carried a small bouquet of flowers and enough gossip to fill an afternoon. After discussing doctors, hospital food, and the weather, she lowered her voice. "Grace has been here every day, you know. So everyone keeps telling me." Susan looked surprised. "No, Eleanor. I mean every day, before visiting hours." After visiting ours. She has practically lived here this week. I glanced toward the empty chair beside the window. That does not change the past. Susan studied me for a moment. Maybe not. But sometimes we only notice the things that support what we already believe. Her words irritated me because they sounded uncomfortably true. After she left, I spent hours thinking about the years since Daniel married Grace. In my memories, every disagreement seemed clear. Every misunderstanding appeared obvious. Yet the more I examined those memories, the less certain I felt. There had been birthdays when Grace sent thoughtful gifts. There had been phone calls checking on me after minor illnesses. There had been invitations I declined because I assumed they were obligations rather than genuine gestures. By late afternoon, Daniel arrived carrying coffee and paperwork from his office. He looked exhausted. During our conversation, his phone rang repeatedly. Meetings, clients, deadlines. The demands never seemed to end. As I watched him juggle responsibilities, another uncomfortable thought surfaced. What if Daniel's distance had not been caused by Grace at all? What if I had blamed the wrong person for years? That evening, Grace returned carrying a small overnight bag. She settled into the chair beside the window exactly as she had the night before. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Then she reached into her bag and removed a worn manila folder. She placed it gently on the table beside my bed. "If you really want answers," she said quietly, "this is where they begin." For several moments I looked at the manila folder without touching it. It appeared ordinary, slightly worn around the edges. Nothing about it suggested that it contained answers capable of changing years of assumptions. Grace remained quiet. She did not push it toward me. She did not explain. She simply waited. Finally, I opened it. Inside were copies of emails, printed messages, and handwritten notes organized by date. The first few pages confused me. Then slowly a pattern emerged. Several emails involved family gatherings I had never attended. At first, I assumed they would confirm what I had always believed, that Grace had excluded me. Instead, I found invitations. Detailed invitations. Holiday dinners. Birthday celebrations. Weekend visits. Some included follow-up messages asking if I had received the original email. My stomach tightened. I had never seen any of them. Where did these come from? I asked quietly. "Daniel kept copies," Grace replied. "He thought they might matter someday." I turned another page. Then another. There were messages discussing transportation arrangements when my car was being repaired. There were offers to help after minor medical appointments. There were reminders about family events. Many of them showed no response from me because I had never received them. I looked up at Grace. "Are you telling me these were never delivered?" She nodded slowly. "Not all of them." The answer unsettled me. Someone had clearly wanted communication to fail. Someone had benefited from misunderstandings growing larger over time. Yet I still struggled to accept what I was seeing. "Why show me this now?" I asked. Grace glanced toward the window before answering. "Because you deserve the truth." I continued reading. One document caught my attention immediately. It was a handwritten note from several years earlier after I had undergone a minor medical procedure. I remembered that week clearly. I remembered feeling disappointed because Daniel and Grace never visited. According to the note, Grace had spent 2 afternoons at my house delivering meals while I was asleep. A neighbor had accepted them on my behalf. The realization felt strange. That memory had lived in my mind for years as proof that she did not care. Yet the reality appeared very different. As the evening passed, more examples surfaced. Small moments, small misunderstandings, small wounds that accumulated over time. None of them seemed dramatic individually. Together, they painted an entirely different picture. "Why did you never defend yourself?" I finally asked. Grace gave a tired smile. "Because every time I tried, it made things worse." Her answer lingered in the room long after she spoke. For the first time, I began wondering how many arguments had been built upon missing information. How many conclusions had been reached before all the facts were known. Near midnight, Grace gathered the papers and returned them to the folder. Before closing it completely, one final item slipped free and landed on the blanket beside me. It was a folded letter addressed in familiar handwriting. The moment I saw the name at the bottom, my heart skipped. The letter had been written by my late husband, and according to the date, he had written it nearly 4 years before he passed away. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the letter. For a moment, the hospital room disappeared. The sounds of the hallway faded. All I could see was my husband's familiar handwriting. Grace remained silent beside the window, giving me space. The letter began simply, "My dearest Eleanor." I smiled sadly. Harold always started his letters that way. As I continued reading, however, my expression slowly changed. Harold wrote that if I was reading this letter, it meant certain concerns he had carried for years were finally becoming important. He explained that he had noticed tensions growing within the family long before I did. At first, he assumed they were ordinary misunderstandings. Then he began noticing something unusual. Information often reached different people in different forms. Conversations were repeated incorrectly. Invitations disappeared. Messages arrived incomplete. Small disagreements somehow became larger every time they were retold. Harold admitted that he spent years trying to understand why. Then I reached a sentence that made me stop breathing for a second. "Grace is not your problem." I read the line twice. Then a third time. The words refused to change. "Grace is not your problem." Harold went on to explain that he had quietly observed countless interactions between us. He wrote that Grace often tried to repair situations after conflicts occurred. He described occasions when she defended me during conversations I never witnessed. He mentioned family gatherings where she encouraged Daniel to spend more time with me. Some of the examples were so specific that I could picture them clearly. Yet I had never known they happened. My eyes drifted toward Grace. She was looking out the window, unaware that I was studying her. Suddenly, memories returned in a different light. The Christmas gifts, the unexpected phone calls, the invitations I ignored because I assumed they were insincere. How many things had I misunderstood? Harold's letter continued. He explained that someone close to the family seemed to benefit whenever communication broke down. He never identified the person directly because he lacked proof. Instead, he encouraged me to remain open-minded and pay attention to patterns rather than assumptions. The advice sounded exactly like him. Calm, patient, thoughtful, never rushing toward conclusions. By the time I reached the final page, tears had gathered in my eyes. Not because the letter was dramatic. It was not. It was honest. Honest in a way that forced me to question years of certainty. At the bottom, Harold had written one final message. If you ever find yourself choosing between pride and truth, choose truth. You may lose your certainty, but you will find your family. I folded the letter carefully and placed it on my lap. The room remained quiet for several moments. Finally, I looked at Grace. "Why did you keep this all these years?" I asked softly. She turned toward me. There was sadness in her eyes, but no resentment. "Because your husband asked me to," she said. I stared at her. "You knew about this letter?" She nodded. "He gave it to me himself." Another silence filled the room. Then Grace added something that unsettled me even more. That was not the only thing he left behind. Grace waited while I processed what she had said. The hospital room felt unusually still. Even the sounds from the hallway seemed distant. I looked down at Harold's letter resting on my lap and wondered how many things my husband had understood long before I did. What else did he leave behind? I asked quietly. Grace reached for the manila folder and carefully removed a smaller envelope from inside. It was sealed and marked with a date from nearly 3 years earlier. "He asked me to keep this safe," she said. "He believed there might come a time when you would need to see it." My heart tightened. Harold had never been secretive by nature. If he went to the trouble of preparing something like this, he must have had a reason. Slowly, I opened the envelope. Inside were copies of handwritten notes and several printed messages. At first, they seemed unrelated. Then I noticed a pattern. Certain conversations had been reported differently depending on who received them. Remarks made by one family member appeared altered before reaching another. Small disagreements became larger after being repeated. Innocent comments somehow returned sounding critical or unkind. I read through the pages carefully. None of it seemed dramatic. In fact, that was what made it unsettling. The damage had not come from one major event. It had come from hundreds of tiny distortions over many years. "Harold found these?" I asked. Grace nodded. He started keeping records when he realized the same misunderstandings kept happening. I sat quietly for a moment. Memories surfaced one after another. A canceled dinner, a missed birthday, a tense holiday conversation. Situations I had blamed on Grace without hesitation. Yet now I could see how incomplete my understanding had been. "Why did he trust you with this?" I finally asked. Grace looked surprised by the question. "Because he knew I would protect it." There was no pride in her voice. No satisfaction, just simple honesty. I found that difficult to ignore. As the evening passed, she told me more about those final years before Harold's death. She described private conversations they shared when he became concerned about growing divisions within the family. According to Grace, he often worried less about arguments themselves and more about how quickly people stopped speaking directly to one another. The more she talked, the more I recognized Harold's way of thinking. He always believed truth became clearer when people communicated openly. Sometime after 10 o'clock, Daniel called. Grace stepped into the hallway to answer, giving me privacy. Through the partially open door, I could hear fragments of the conversation. Her voice remained calm and supportive. She sounded concerned about me. Not obligated. Not resentful. Concerned. When she returned, she placed her phone in her purse and sat back down. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I noticed another document partially visible inside the folder. Unlike the others, this one carried a name I recognized immediately. The moment I saw it, a chill ran through me. Because the name belonged to someone I had trusted completely for years. For a long moment, I stared at the document without reaching for it. The name printed near the top belonged to Susan Harper, my closest friend, the woman who had sat beside me through birthdays, anniversaries, and the funeral after Harold passed away. The woman I trusted enough to hold a spare key to my house. "This does not make sense," I whispered. Grace did not answer immediately. She simply handed me the document. My hands felt unusually heavy as I began reading. The first page contained notes written by Harold. The second included copies of messages. The third contained a timeline. By the time I reached the bottom of the final page, I felt as though the floor beneath me had shifted. According to Harold's records, Susan had frequently positioned herself between family members whenever disagreements occurred. She often volunteered to relay messages. She frequently offered explanations on behalf of other people. At first glance, none of it seemed suspicious. In fact, it looked helpful. But when Harold compared original conversations with the versions that eventually reached other family members, important details had changed. Sometimes comments sounded harsher. Sometimes invitations appeared less sincere. Sometimes intentions were completely misunderstood. I lowered the papers and stared out the hospital window. The city lights blurred slightly. Harold was sure? I asked. Grace shook her head. No. He was careful. He was never sure. He only documented what he observed. That answer sounded exactly like my husband. He believed evidence mattered more than assumptions. The irony was painful. I had spent years making assumptions about Grace while Harold quietly collected facts. Why would Susan do something like this? I asked. Grace folded her hands in her lap. I do not know. Maybe she liked being needed. Maybe she enjoyed being the person everyone trusted. Maybe she never realized how much damage it caused. I thought back over countless conversations. Susan telling me Daniel was too busy. Susan explaining why Grace seemed distant. Susan interpreting comments I never heard directly. Memory after memory resurfaced. None of them looked the same anymore. What disturbed me most was not the possibility of bad intentions. It was the possibility that I had allowed someone else's voice to become louder than my own family's. Near midnight, fatigue finally settled over me. Grace adjusted the blanket at the foot of my bed and prepared to spend another night in the uncomfortable chair by the window. You should go home, I said quietly. She smiled. You have said that every day. Maybe I mean it this time. Her smile softened. Maybe I am staying anyway. For the first time in many years, I found myself smiling back. It was a small moment. Brief. Almost insignificant. Yet it felt important. The next morning I woke before sunrise. Grace was already awake, reading through paperwork beneath the glow of a small lamp. The sight stirred an unexpected feeling. Not suspicion. Not irritation. Gratitude. Then my phone vibrated on the bedside table. The caller ID displayed Susan Harper. As I stared at the screen, my heart began to race. After everything I had learned, I no longer knew whether I was about to speak with my closest friend or the person responsible for years of division within my family. The phone continued vibrating on the bedside table until I finally answered it. Good morning, Susan said cheerfully. Her voice sounded exactly as it always had. Warm, familiar, comfortable. For years that voice had brought me reassurance. Now it brought questions. Good morning, I replied carefully. Grace glanced up from her chair, but said nothing. I was planning to stop by later, Susan said. How are you feeling? I looked toward the window. The sky was beginning to brighten as sunrise spread across the city. Better, I answered. The doctors seem optimistic. That is wonderful news. There was a brief pause. Then she added, Have Daniel and Grace been around much? The question immediately caught my attention. Before, I would have answered without thinking. Now I listened differently. They have both been here, I said. Another pause followed. Well, Susan said slowly, that is surprising. I did not respond. You know how busy they usually are, she continued. Especially Grace. Something about the comment felt familiar. Not because it was dramatic, because it was exactly the kind of small observation I had accepted for years without question. A subtle suggestion. A gentle conclusion offered before I formed my own. Actually, I said, Grace has been here almost constantly. Silence filled the line. It lasted only a second, but I noticed it. That is nice, Susan finally replied. I am glad she is making the effort. After we ended the call, I sat quietly for several minutes. Grace returned to her paperwork. Neither of us mentioned the conversation. Yet something had changed. For the first time, I was hearing old patterns clearly. Later that afternoon, Daniel arrived carrying a bag of takeout soup and sandwiches. He looked relieved to find me sitting up in bed. While we ate lunch together, I asked questions I should have asked years ago. Not accusations. Questions. Had he really stopped inviting me to family gatherings? Had he forgotten birthdays? Had Grace discouraged visits? Each answer surprised me. Daniel described invitations I never received. Phone calls that were never returned because I did not know they happened. Attempts to reconnect after disagreements that somehow never reached me. As he spoke, I could see genuine confusion in his face. He was discovering the same puzzle from a different angle. Mom, he said quietly, I always thought you needed space. Why would you think that? He frowned. Because I kept hearing that from people close to you. The words hung in the air. People close to you. Not Grace. Not me. Someone else. After Daniel left, I found myself studying the years behind us. One memory after another resurfaced. The more I looked, the more a troubling pattern emerged. Susan had been present during nearly every major misunderstanding, every conflict, every period of distance. That evening, as the hospital lights dimmed and visitors went home, Grace closed the folder and looked directly at me. There is one more thing you need to know, she said softly. The seriousness in her voice immediately captured my attention. Then she opened the folder to a page I had not yet seen. At the top was a date. Beneath it was a conversation Harold had recorded shortly before his death. And according to his notes, it changed everything. Grace slid the page across the blanket toward me. The paper looked ordinary, but the expression on her face told me otherwise. I began reading. The document was not a letter. It was a summary Harold had written after a conversation he considered important enough to preserve. According to his notes, the discussion took place less than 6 months before his death. At first, the details seemed harmless. Susan had stopped by the house for coffee. They spoke about family, retirement, and health concerns. Then the tone shifted. Harold recorded several comments that immediately caught my attention. Susan repeatedly suggested that Daniel and I needed distance from one another. She described family disagreements as unavoidable and even healthy. More troubling, she encouraged Harold not to interfere when misunderstandings occurred. As I continued reading, my chest tightened. Harold noted that Susan seemed unusually informed about private conversations she should not have known about. He also wrote that she often presented herself as a mediator while quietly increasing tension between people. At the bottom of the page, Harold had added a personal observation. If communication improves, her influence disappears. I lowered the paper slowly. The room felt very quiet. He really believed this? I asked. Grace nodded. Not immediately. That is why he kept documenting things. He wanted proof before drawing conclusions. I looked back at the notes. Everything Harold described matched the pattern that had slowly emerged over the past several days. The missing invitations, the altered messages, the misunderstandings that never seemed to end. For years I had viewed each incident separately. Harold had seen the larger picture. Why did he never tell me? I whispered. Grace looked down briefly. He tried. I stared at her. What do you mean? She reached into the folder again and removed several printed emails. They were addressed to me. Some contained attachments. Others referenced conversations Harold wanted us to have. I had never seen any of them. My stomach sank. There it was again. More communication that somehow never reached me. More opportunities lost. More years wasted. Tears gathered in my eyes. But this time, they were different. Not anger. Regret. I thought about the countless occasions when Grace had tried to reconnect. the invitations I ignored, the assumptions I embraced, the judgments I made. Through all of it, she had remained present. She had attended family gatherings, helped Daniel, supported Harold during his final illness. And now she was sitting beside my hospital bed when she had every reason to walk away. The realization hurt more than any misunderstanding. As evening settled outside the window, I finally looked directly at her. "Why are you still here?" I asked softly. Grace seemed surprised. "Because you are family." The answer was simple, honest, uncomplicated. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then my phone buzzed again on the bedside table. A new message had arrived from Susan. It was brief. She wanted to visit first thing in the morning. As I stared at the screen, I realized that for the first time in years, I was no longer afraid of learning the truth. I was ready to hear it face to face. Susan arrived shortly after 9 o'clock the next morning, carrying a small bouquet of flowers and the same warm smile I had known for years. If I had not spent the previous days reading Harold's notes and reviewing the documents Grace shared with me, I might have seen nothing unusual. But now I noticed everything. The careful questions, the way she immediately asked whether Daniel had visited, the way she glanced toward Grace before looking back at me. Grace stood near the window, calm and silent. Susan greeted her politely, but there was tension beneath the courtesy. After a few minutes of small talk, I decided to stop avoiding the truth. "Susan," I said quietly, "I have been reading some of Harold's papers." Her smile faltered slightly. "Oh." He kept records about several family misunderstandings. The room became very still. Susan lowered herself into a chair beside my bed. "Harold always kept records," she said with a nervous laugh. "You know how he was." I nodded. "I do." Then I told her what I had learned. Not accusations. Facts. Missing invitations. Altered messages. Conversations that somehow changed as they passed through different people. With each example, Susan's expression grew more serious. Finally, she looked down at her hands. For a long moment, nobody spoke. When she finally answered, her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. "I never meant for things to go this far." The words settled heavily in the room. She explained that years earlier she had become increasingly involved in family matters because everyone trusted her. At first she believed she was helping, offering advice, clarifying misunderstandings, smoothing over disagreements. But gradually she began speaking for people instead of encouraging them to speak directly to one another. Assumptions replaced conversations. Interpretations replaced facts. And over time, those small changes created larger divisions. "I thought I was protecting everyone from conflict," she said quietly. "Instead, I became part of it." I listened without interrupting. The explanation did not erase the hurt. It did not restore lost years. Yet for the first time, I saw something other than blame. I saw regret. Eventually, Susan apologized to both me and Grace. The apology was imperfect, emotional, human, but it was sincere. After she left, silence filled the room once again. I looked toward Grace, the woman I had blamed for so much. The woman who sat beside my hospital bed every night. The woman who protected Harold's letters, his records, and ultimately the truth itself. "I owe you an apology too," I said softly. Grace's eyes widened. "Eleanor." "No," I interrupted gently. "Let me finish." I told her about the assumptions I made, the invitations I ignored, the judgments I accepted without question. I admitted that I had been wrong. When I finished speaking, tears filled both our eyes. Then Grace smiled. Not a triumphant smile, not a relieved smile, just a kind one. The kind that asks for nothing in return. A few days later, I was discharged from the hospital. Daniel met us at the entrance with the car. As we walked toward the parking lot beneath a bright blue sky, I realized something Harold understood long ago. Families are not saved by pride. They are saved by truth, patience, and the people who stay when leaving would be easier. For years, I believed Grace was the enemy standing between me and my family. In the end, she was the person standing beside me, protecting what mattered most.